Was it a sin for the Israelites to have horses and chariots? I have gotten in my head over the years that the answer was yes, and then struggled when you find David acquiring chariots and horses and other kings afterward. Well, maybe God changed his mind or something along those lines. I think that I probably took a few verses out of context and misunderstood what God was trying to say. I don't think it's the horses and chariots that are sinful so much as the attitude toward the horses and chariots. This came up in conversation in my study of the book of Micah this month. We were going through the minor prophets, and I came to Micah chapter 1 and verse number 13. Harness the horses to the chariot, you residents of Lachish. This was the beginning of sin for daughter Zion, because Israel's acts of rebellion can be traced to you. Well, that makes it sound like horses and chariots, especially horses and chariots in Lachish, wherever that is, were the beginning of sin and therefore necessarily sinful. Well, I'm not sure that's exactly what Micah is trying to say. I think what he's saying is that in Lachish, with regard to chariots and horses, you chose to go down a road that resulted in the destruction of the entire nation. Now, if you don't know your geography, Lachish is the southernmost fortified city in Israel, in the land of Israel, in the tribe of Judah. Lachish is where, therefore, any kind of trade with Egypt was going to come through. And since Egypt was the main purveyor of horses and chariots in this time in history, that trade was going to go through Lachish. And evidently it did go through Lachish, taking what Micah says here. That's a mistake. That's a problem. And it's a problem that God warned against in times past. In Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 16, we're told there about a king that was going to come to the land. Eventually, they're going to have a king. They were to be appoint one from among their brothers. Verse number 15 says, not one of the foreigners. However, it says, he must not acquire many horses for himself or send the people back to Egypt to acquire many horses. For the Lord has told you, you are never to go back that way again. The point is not that you can't own a horse. The point is that you're not supposed to depend on Egypt and trust that these horses, these chariots pulled by horses, that you would get from Egypt are going to be the key to success versus failure in your conflict that you're going to have in this new land. In chapter 20, the same kind of thing. In verse number 1, when you go out to war against your enemies and see horses, chariots, and an army larger than yours, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt is with you. The confidence comes in God, and oftentimes we put our confidence in ourselves, or at least we wind up looking very much like we're doing that. And I want to make some applications of this concept of chariots here today and preach to myself a little bit while we're at it here, because my tendency oftentimes, and maybe yours as well, is to look to the Bible for some kind of official thumbs up, thumbs down on a particular behavior that we may in the back of our mind, or maybe not even in the back of our mind, consider to be maybe a little bit sketchy, maybe a little bit inappropriate, and certainly we're in favor of binding where God has bound. But binding where God is not bound, we tell people we shouldn't do that, and so we shouldn't do it ourselves. And maybe God is not exactly as strict about such and such a subject as he might be, and so therefore it might be okay for us to do it. And we essentially create little wiggle room here for doing things that we know are not good for us necessarily, but maybe they aren't sinful either, and so therefore maybe it's okay. I think chariots are a good example of this, the beginning of evil, the beginning of rebellion among the people of God. Doesn't start with a thou shalt or thou shalt not, at least not here in Micah chapter 1. It starts with doing something that is defensible, pardon the expression, on the surface of it, but at its core, and without a whole lot of investigation, you can see that it's this way at its core. At its core, it is trusting in yourself rather than trusting in God. And what I want to do here is look at the idea of chariots a little bit and try to find a way to emphasize in our own mind, and me preach to myself a little bit with regard to this too, thinking that it's more complicated than simply saying, does the Bible condemn this specific activity? There is a good road and there is a bad road. And sometimes the road that leads to hell begins with a step that may not be definitively sinful as we might define definitively sinful, as it were. Anyway, let me take you through a few of these passages about chariots, and I'll explain to you what we're talking about here. Was it sinful to own a chariot? Didn't I read something about how the people of Israel were supposed to destroy the chariots? Yes, actually, you do read that in Joshua chapter 11, verse 6, I think it is. The people of God, when they were to win a battle against these chariot featuring armies, they were to destroy the chariots and hamstring the horses, so that not only would the chariots not be used, the horses wouldn't be used to pull chariots. If it so happened that they were to lose some ground and the people were come back, and they would take their chariots back and repair them and move forward, as it were. The people of Israel did not have metalworking capability at this point. We're told in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 19, there was no blacksmith in the land. Only 2 swords existed. Where they got those swords, the text is not exactly clear, but they only had 2, one for Saul, one for Jonathan. And if Israel wanted to do so much as to sharpen its plows, they had to go to the Philistines, because the Philistines had metalworking. They had blacksmiths. They could do that kind of thing. Realistically speaking, the Israelites, in the early days at least, wouldn't have known what to do with the chariots. And so taking them and keeping them was not really a practical consideration. It was just nothing more than a gratification of your own ego. David eventually is going to take a few chariots and keep them for himself, and no doubt train his army how to use them properly, etc. And eventually the nation was able to catch up, as it were, technologically with the rest of the nations. But in these early days especially, chariots were what they had, as it were, not what God wanted them to have. And of course, God gave them the victory without the chariots. God didn't require anything from a practical standpoint to give them the victory. He was able to do that with or without chariots, and he did with or without chariots. So from a practical standpoint, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense for the Israelites to have chariots. I think that's the main reason why chariots are spoken of very poorly in the early days, because that's what the other nations had. It's not what God had or what God needed. And we're going to see the cultural aspect of the chariots here as we go along here. But I think from a spiritual standpoint, the idea of chariots really comes through very strongly. Building chariots, emphasizing chariots, was not specifically rebelling against God's will, so much as it was questioning God's ability to deliver, God's ability to conquer. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 7 speaks of the great deliverance of the people of God, when the mountain of the Lord would be exalted above all the mountains, and all nations are going to flow to it, and these nations with their chariots are going to come to naught, because this king was going to be greater than any chariot-led army that might come against him. And of course, that's talking primarily, if not exclusively, about the spiritual nation of Israel under the spiritual king Jesus, and spiritual enemies epitomized by these chariots, as it were. No weapon that's fashioned against us will stand, as we sing sometimes. The idea that we as the people of God are empowered to succeed no matter what kind of technological advancement may be coming along out there. Our victory comes from God, not from ourselves, not from our own think-sos or our own cleverness, etc. There's a great psalm written to praise the king and to emphasize the king's connection to God, Psalm 20. And especially verse number 7, some may trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will trust in the name of the Lord our God. The idea that a victorious king among the people of God ultimately puts his confidence in God and his ability to deliver far more than any kind of army he may put in the field or any weapon he may put in the hand of the army. That's not to say you don't have an army, you don't have weapons in that situation. Certainly we do our best in God's service, and that's the case today as well. But no matter what we may do in his service, no matter what technology may be available or not available to us, our confidence is always in God, not in ourselves, not in what we ourselves are able to do for ourselves. There's a world of difference between trusting in our technology, our advancements, and trusting in God. If you want to put a website together, if you want to do a podcast, if you want to get on an airplane and go to some far off country and preach the gospel, if in any other way you want to use the modern technology available to us in this world, and thank God for it, use it in his service to his glory, then by all means do so. Nothing wrong with that. A lot of noble warriors in God's service got in a chariot over the years. But those who are truly devoted to God realize that whatever kind of fruit comes from this, whatever kind of glory comes does not come to the weapon, does not come to the device, does not come to the technology, and certainly doesn't come to the person who's wielding those things. God is the one who gives the victory. If he could give victory to Gideon and a handful of shepherds with torches and pitchers and loud voices and such, if he can give victory to Joshua and people who are marching around city walls for days upon days, he can give victory, he will give victory to you and me. And sometimes our emphasis on our own cleverness, our own approach, our own inventions, as it were, will eventually wind up giving glory to ourselves. And we kind of like it that way. We shouldn't want it that way. Glory always goes to God. Now, having said that, let me emphasize the cultural aspect of it also, because we see over and over again with regard to chariots, that chariots are affiliated far more often than not with the bad guys. It's not morally wrong to have a chariot. That's not the way typically it is presented to us, but we do consistently see chariots as being attached thematically to the bad guys, to the wrong people. And later on in Micah chapter 5, when the people are going to be cast down, the evil Israelites are going to be brought down, part of their destruction is going to be the destruction of their chariots and horses. Well, what harm did the chariots and horses do? Well, nothing, not specifically. The walled cities are going to come down too. That doesn't mean it's wrong to have a walled city. The problem is that acquiring chariots and horses is yet another example of the people wanting to be like the nations round about them. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 5, and other passages also. Why is it that people want to have a king? Why is it that the people want to have this, that, or the other? Well, everybody else has it. Well, does that make it good? Does that make it bad? All these other nations are rebelling against the God of heaven. They're rebelling against basic morality. They're condemned. They're about to be destroyed. That's why you're in the land of Canaan in the first place, to destroy these nations. Why would you want to be like them? Well, what's wrong with being like them? We could be like them if we want to. Well, maybe. There are probably some aspects of our culture that are harmless in and of themselves, morally neutral, you might say. And certainly we can say that with regard to clothing choices and entertainment choices and on and on we could go, things that pertain to this culture that don't seem on the surface to be inherently evil. There's no obvious connection to such things and hellfire. And maybe there's not, just like the chariots and the horses. But could it be that our attachment to the chariots and horses is what it is because we envy the world for its worldliness? We envy the world for what it is, what it enjoys, all the blessings that they acquire for themselves apart from a relationship with God. We're told over and over again in the Psalms and other passages as well that we're not supposed to envy the wicked. And that's a real problem sometimes, especially in an affluent culture like ours. We see people acquiring chariots and horses for themselves. We see them getting rich. We see them getting famous and powerful and all of this. And we start envying that. Would it be a bad thing if I were to make $1 million? Would it be a bad thing if I were to have 100,000 followers on TikTok or whatever it happens to be? Well, no, maybe not. But is that a goal worthy of the people of God? Simply because other people have it, worldly people have it, and they enjoy it, and it seems like it'd be kind of enjoyable for us as well. Does that inherently make it a noble pursuit? And obviously the answer is no. Now, what we usually do in this situation is try to have our cake and eat it too. And maybe you can do that. I'm not suggesting you can't have $1 million or 100,000 followers on TikTok or whatever and still be right with God. Maybe you can. I have no doubt that many people have. There are plenty of rich people in the Bible, for instance, Abraham, Job, etc., who served God very faithfully. Their riches were seen as an extension of their worship, an extension of their connection to God. That's perfectly okay. I'm sure you can do it with your horses and chariots too. Here's the thing, though. The deeper we get into the things of the world, the more inclined we are to value and prioritize the things of the world. And the solution may not be simply to stop when it gets too bad. Maybe the solution should be to stop before we get really on that road at all. Now, this is, the time in our podcast. This is the time in our sermon where I'm supposed to tell you to throw away your TVs and your laptops and get offline and all that, which I'm not going to do. I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to do that, to be perfectly honest with you. But there is something to be said for emphasizing purity and holiness and righteousness to the exclusion of things that do not qualify along these lines. The classic text in Philippians chapter 4 and verse number 8, of course, touches directly on this. Chapter 4 and verse 8, I may have gotten that backward. Chapter 4, verse 8, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any moral excellence and anything praiseworthy, dwell on these things. If you put your emphasis on things that are not just okay, but that promote spiritual goodness, that promote spiritual values in your life, then you're not going to find yourself in these moral quagmires. You're not going to find yourself choosing between your horses and chariots and your relationship with God. Well, it shouldn't have to come to that. Well, maybe it won't come to that. But if we can back away from the whole concept of valuing these carnal things so much, then maybe we can avoid the problems that come in with valuing them too much. That is an extremely difficult line to walk. I'm not going to pretend like it isn't. But being aware of the problem, I think, is step number one. If horses and chariots can be the first step toward rebellion, the first step toward wickedness among the people of God, surely the same thing can be said for us as well. I don't know what particular application of this concept is going to be appropriate in your life and your wherever you happen to be in God's world. But wherever it happens to be, let's not content ourselves with simply checking boxes, with simply not committing fornication, not robbing banks, not killing people, etc. That's good. A lot of people can't get to that place. And you have, presumably, and that's a good thing. Thank you very much for doing that. May your tribe increase. But we can do better than that. We can actually learn to value God and trust in God and put our cultural ties in God so that the latest whatever it is in this world, and it changes every week, seems like these days, whatever it happens to be that the world just absolutely can't do without, you realize the thing you can't do without is God. The thing you can't do without is a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. You emphasize that, you dwell in that place, that spiritual place, and let whatever happens to fall away in the process. The only thing that matters is having the victory that Jesus provides for you in your spiritual conflict. You find your contentment there, and you're going to find out that the horses and chariots didn't mean nearly as much as you thought they did. I hope that this is a practical consideration for you. I hope that you can build your faith and build your confidence in God and draw near to Him regardless of where you happen to be in this life or whatever technological boom or bust may happen in this world. God will see you through and see you all the way to heaven in the end. Thank you very much for studying along, and God bless.